Business owners, stop doing this. I've done these videos before. Here's another one. It's about debt. I'm going to answer the question, how does debt-free affect your business? And the answer is it doesn't. I have had so many business owners come to me and say, this is a great business, I have no debt. Here's the reality. The business buyer doesn't really care how much debt you have. And 99% of deals are an asset sale, which means you sell the business free and clear, AKA you pay your debts as you're walking out the door. Here's the good news, you get to keep your cash. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea about debt in a business and share some perspective about debt. So here's a personal perspective. In the year 2016, I personally took on 100 years of debt. Before 2016, I had this cautious approach to debt. I saw some family members struggle with debt. I was afraid of debt. I paid cash for everything. I didn't like debt. And then I had some education around debt and I got into real estate investing. And it's true. In 2016, I took on 3 30-year loans and 1 10-year loan all at the same time. And guess what? Those were some of the best investments that I'd ever made. And that was 2016. So 8 years ago, as I record this, maybe a little bit more than that. But those were the best investments that I made. I mentioned the time I invested in because I was a younger man then. Those investments are still making money. Those debt levels are being paid down by other people as the properties create money. But that's an example of I made a decision to take on debt. And there's good debt and bad debt. By the way, buying a car, taking on debt for that, not good debt. Buying a house that makes money, or a business that makes money, that pays for the debt, that's good debt, right? So this gets into some, I call it asset management types of ideas around how do you manage your money. But the age thing is really important. We did a deal earlier this year and the owner said, this is a great business, I have no debt. He actually paid off all of his trucks. It was a sizable business because he was making so much money. And he was really proud of the fact that he had debt. It was great. When we closed the deal, there was nothing to pay off. Everything had already been paid off. Wouldn't have been a problem because there was enough money when we closed it in order to pay things off. But guess what? It was a younger man who bought his business. And that man took on an SBA loan for $2 million. He was bringing debt into the business. Here's what I'm getting at around debt and why it matters. A lot of times when people say, I have no debt, what they're really saying is, I'm a little bit older, my risk tolerance is less, so I don't want to take on the risk of debt. I'm looking at the end of my career. I'm not going to have a chance to pay off this debt. I'm not going to invest in the business because I'm debt averse, because I'm taking less risk, take money off the table. That's why I'm selling. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But keep in mind that on the front end of it, the business buyer is taking on they're bringing their own risk, their own debt into the business. So you get your debt out, you get their debt in, often they're taking more debt and more risk. The risk is, SBA loans are pretty serious, very serious. People pledge their home, their personal guarantee. It's really ugly stuff if you don't pay an SBA loan. Think about debt that way. It does not affect the price of the business in the way that I described. But there's another angle to this. When the buyer's going into it and they're thinking about how much they can borrow, because again, they're probably not going to pay cash. The person going out the door built the business from the ground up and borrowed slowly, small chunks for that next truck or whatever. But that's all been paid off. Now it makes a lot of money. It's worth millions of dollars. The guy coming in or the gal coming in is borrowing all that money, most of it at once, 90% at least if it's SBA. And they're highly, highly subjective to whatever the interest rate is. So here's where debt does affect a business. When interest rates go up, business buyers can afford to borrow less because they have to pay higher fees every month. It does affect the value of the business in terms of what the buyer can borrow. And that's a mitigating factor. Now, most owners are going to say, I don't care how they pay for it. I just want to get paid. That's their problem, how they get the money. But the reality is, if this company that I'm talking about, service company that I was talking about earlier, that happened earlier, someone's not going to just drop a couple $1 million and own or operate a company like that. They're going to leverage to get into it. The large audience of buyers, almost all of them are going to leverage. So that really makes the interest rate a material fact. When interest rates go up, it's harder to borrow money. It directly affects price. One way to value a business, in addition to the multiple of cash flow, which is the number one way that businesses are valued, is how much can it be financed for by a bank? Because when a business owner prices it above that, they're basically saying, I'm looking for a all cash buyer, or I'm going to seller finance it. That's basically what they're saying. Remember, the only ways that people can buy money are all cash, seller financing, SBA, or some combination thereof. So interest rates are going to be a factor unless people are paying all cash. And savvy business buyers just don't pay all cash. They want to leverage. They're taking risk and they're using other people's money. Back to my story, when I discovered the power of financing, I remember thinking, I'm doing this by myself, but I got a great business partner. It's a bank. The bank is my business partner. They're giving me the money and it's enabling me to get into these real estate investments, and they don't have a mouthpiece on them, right? I mean, I have to pay the mortgage, but it's not an actual person that I'm doing business with. So the bank is a partner in these deals, and the rate of the borrowing directly affects the value of the business. So those are my thoughts. When people come to us and say, great business, no debt, I think that's good, but you're focusing on the wrong part of the deal. Hey, that's something I found interesting this week. I hear that all the time from business owners. They come in and they say, great business, no debt. And I say, let's talk about other things about the business besides the debt load. How much cash flow does it make? That's typically where we go next. But congrats on having no debt. What are your thoughts? What are you worried about with selling your business, with buying a business? If you're an advisor, talk to me about what your clients are saying. You can put your comments down below or reach out to me directly. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm Neil Isaacs, the Raleigh Business Broker. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll help.